Imagine a garden where everything was perfect. There was no sadness and no fear, and you could walk with God in the cool of the day. But even in this perfect place, there was one rule and one choice that would change everything forever. You'll hear the whisper of a snake with a tricky question, and you'll feel the moment when a perfect friendship with God was broken. Dim the lights and let the garden grow quiet. Chapter 1. The Beautiful Garden. In the beginning, there was a garden, and it was perfect. Sunlight, soft and golden as honey, spilled through a canopy of emerald leaves, dappling the lush ground where flowers bloomed in impossible colors. The air hummed with a gentle, life-giving warmth, carrying the scent of rich soil, blooming jasmine, and the crisp, clean fragrance of water from a river that divided into 4 headwaters, weaving through the landscape like liquid silver. This was Eden, a sanctuary crafted by divine hands, a place where every leaf, every stone, and every breath of wind was a testament to flawless creation. Into this paradise, God placed the man, Adam, formed from the very dust of the earth and animated with the breath of life. He was the garden's steward, its caretaker, and its first inhabitant. His days were a serene rhythm of purpose and peace. He would walk along the riverbanks, his feet sinking into the cool, velvety moss, and watch as fish, scaled in sapphire and topaz, darted through the clear water. In the sun-drenched meadows, lions with magnificent manes would lie down beside lambs, their eyes reflecting not hunger, but a shared tranquil contentment. Adam knew each creature, not just by sight, but by spirit, and a silent, harmonious understanding flowed between them. He spent his hours tending to the groves of fruit trees, their branches heavy with succulent, jewel-toned offerings. The grapes hung in perfect, heavy clusters, their skins taut with sweet juice. There was no struggle here, no thorn or thistle to mar the soil. The earth yielded its abundance willingly, joyfully, for his sustenance. In the cool of the evening, a palpable presence would walk in the garden, and Adam felt no fear, only a profound sense of belonging and communion. Yet as the days stretched into a seamless tapestry of perfection, a quiet ache began to grow in the center of Adam's being. It was a hollow space that the beauty around him could not fill, an echo that the songs of the birds could not silence. He watched a pair of eagles soaring in effortless tandem, their wings touching as they rode the thermal currents. He observed the deer, the does keeping close to the protective stags as they drank from the river. Every creature, from the mightiest beast to the smallest sparrow, had a companion, a counterpart with which to share the splendor of existence. Standing alone beneath the sprawling branches of a great oak, Adam felt the weight of his solitude for the first time. The perfection of Eden, which had once felt like an embrace, now felt vast and, in a way he could not fully articulate, incomplete. The harmony was all around him, a symphony of creation, but he stood as a single, silent note, with no other to harmonize. The garden was a masterpiece, but he was alone in its gallery, and the silence between the rustling leaves and bubbling streams began to speak of a loneliness that all the world's beauty could not cure. Chapter 2. Adam's Lonely Heart. The naming began as a sacred duty, a slow and thoughtful procession of discovery that stretched across sun-drenched days and starlit evenings. God brought the creatures to Adam, one by one and two by two, parading the living, breathing poetry of creation before him. The man sat on a sun-warmed rock by the river, And the animals came, their forms a breathtaking tapestry of divine imagination. He watched the lumbering gait of the elephant, its wrinkled skin a map of ancient wisdom, and the name elephant formed in his mind as solid and grand as the beast itself. The giraffe stretched its impossible neck to nibble at the high leaves of an acacia, and the name came, capturing its graceful reach. He named the quick, chattering monkey and the silent, gliding owl. He named the powerful tiger, its stripes like shadows in amber grass, and the delicate hummingbird, a living jewel suspended in air. With each name, a spark of understanding passed between Adam and the creature, a bond of recognition and stewardship. He felt the rough, loyal spirit of the wolf and the gentle, timid heart of the rabbit. The garden was a chorus of identities, and he was the one giving them voice. But as the procession continued, a pattern emerged that began to carve a hollow space deeper within him. They never came alone. The lions arrived together, the male's majestic head held high beside the female's watchful grace. The doves came in pairs, their soft cooing a private language. He saw the foxes, a vixen and her mate, their brushes intertwined as they trotted past. The swans, radiant and white, moved as a single entity on the glassy surface of the river. For every powerful bull, there was a gentle cow. For every proud stallion, a graceful mare. Each pairing was a perfect mirror, a completion that highlighted his own singular reflection. The joy of naming began to curdle into a quiet anguish. He gave them identities, but they already had what he lacked, a shared existence. The deep, rumbling call of the bull was answered by the softer low of the cow. The eagle's piercing cry was met by its mates from a distant crag. He was the sole speaker in a world of dialogues, the only one without an answer to his own call. He wandered away from the naming place, his steps heavy in the pristine earth. The garden's beauty now felt like a taunt. The intertwined branches of the fig trees, the vines clinging to the trunks in intimate embraces, all of nature seemed to be coupled in a joy from which he was excluded. He sat by the river, watching his own solitary reflection ripple in the water, a man surrounded by boundless life, yet utterly alone. The companionship he witnessed was not merely about reproduction, it was about shared presence, a look understood, a burden halved, a joy doubled. It was the missing piece in the paradise crafted just for him. From the unseeable realms, God watched. He saw the light of purpose in Adam's eyes as he named the creatures, but he also saw the shadow that fell across his heart. He witnessed the man's gaze lingering on the paired animals, the subtle droop of his shoulders, the way he turned from the mated pairs as if the sight caused him a physical pain. The divine heart, which had declared all of creation good, now perceived the one thing that was not. It was not good for the man to be alone. The echo in Adam's soul had been heard. The perfect garden had a single flaw, and the Creator, in his infinite wisdom and compassion, began to formulate the final, most intimate act of creation. A helper, a counterpart, a mirror of Adam's own soul was needed to complete the world. Chapter 3. Eve joins. Adam, a profound and gentle sleep, unlike any ordinary slumber, began to descend upon Adam. It was not the tiredness that follows labor, but a divine anesthesia, a sacred stillness that wrapped around his consciousness like the softest velvet. As he rested his head upon a cushion of moss at the base of a great sheltering tree, his breathing slowed and his awareness of the rustling leaves and chattering birds faded into a deep, dreamless quiet. The Creator's hand was upon him, not in judgment, but in profound care, closing his eyes to the world he knew so that a new wonder could be fashioned from his very being. While Adam lay in that holy repose, a mystery unfolded. From his side, from the protective cage of his ribs, a part of him was tenderly, surgically removed. There was no pain, only the silent, deliberate act of a master craftsman at work. The bone, once a hidden part of his frame, was taken and laid upon the earth, a raw material for a masterpiece. Then, the breath of life, the same divine wind that had once animated the dust into Adam, now swept over this new form. Under the touch of infinite power, the rib began to change, to shape and curve and fill with life. Flesh wove itself over the structure, skin as smooth as morning light bloomed, and a new heart began to beat in rhythm with the pulse of creation itself. Where there had been one, there were now two, fashioned from the same essence, designed for perfect unity. Adam stirred, the deep sleep lifting from him as gently as a morning mist. He blinked, the golden light of Eden filtering through his lashes. The world came back into focus, the familiar trees, the chattering stream, the scent of blossoms. But everything felt different. The hollow ache that had resided in his chest was gone, replaced by a sense of wholeness he had never known. And then he saw her. She stood before him, not as a stranger, but as the most familiar part of himself, finally made visible. Her eyes held the same wonder he felt when he first beheld the garden, a reflection of his own soul. Her form was both like his and beautifully, mysteriously different, a perfect complement to his own. This was not another creature to be named from a distance. This was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. A joy so profound it was almost a pain surged through him, a completion so absolute it silenced the last echo of his loneliness forever. She was his counterpart, his helper, his Isha, for she was taken from Ish, man. Together they walked through the garden, and Eden was truly complete. Where Adam had once walked in solitary contemplation, there was now shared silence, a communion that needed no words. He showed her the river where the fish sparkled, and her delight doubled his own. She reached out to touch the petals of a flower he had passed 1,000 times, and through her eyes he saw its intricate beauty anew. They stood before the paired animals, the lions, the swans, the deer, and now, instead of a reminder of lack, it was a celebration of their own mirrored unity. They were the final pair, the crown of creation, the living heart of the garden. The harmony of Eden now resonated within them, a perfect chord played on two heartstrings, and for the first time, under the boundless, approving sky, the world was utterly and completely good. Chapter 4. The Special Tree. In the heart of the garden, where the light fell in cathedral shafts through the emerald canopy, stood a tree unlike any other. Its trunk was ancient and gnarled, a tapestry of silver bark that seemed to hold whispers of eternity, while its leaves shimmered with a deep metallic sheen, catching the sun like polished jade. But it was the fruit that commanded attention, hanging heavy and luminous from the boughs. Each one was a perfect orb, its skin a swirling vortex of gold and ruby, pulsing with a soft inner light that promised profound and dangerous knowledge. This was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the axis around which the freedom of Eden turned. One evening, as the sun bled its last crimson into the western sky, and the first stars pricked the velvet expanse, God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. The divine presence was a comforting warmth, a familiar resonance that had always been part of their existence. But on this walk, the atmosphere shifted from one of shared serenity to one of solemn instruction. They stopped before the singular tree, its anomalous beauty a stark contrast to the untroubled harmony of the surrounding groves. The very air around it seemed to hum with a silent, potent energy. God's voice was not a sound that shattered the peace, but a vibration that deepened it, weaving through the rustling leaves and the soft sigh of the wind. He spoke of this tree, naming it and its terrible power. The fruit was not for them. It was the one boundary in their boundless world, the single line they were not to cross. To eat of it, God explained with a gravity that made the night air still, was to ingest death itself. It was not a threat from a vengeful master, but a warning from a loving Father, a statement of spiritual cause and effect, as immutable as the river's flow. To know good by experiencing evil was to sever the lifeline of pure innocence that connected them to their Creator, and that severance was the essence of death. Adam and Eve listened, their eyes fixed on the forbidden fruit. They saw its captivating beauty, the way it seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe within its gleaming skin. The warning settled in their hearts. A cold, clear stone dropped into the warm waters of their bliss. They understood the terms of their paradise. Their perfect freedom was rooted in this one simple obedience. It was a test of trust, a choice to live in dependent love rather than grasp for a knowledge that would ultimately destroy them. Looking from the tree back to the divine presence, they felt no resentment at the restriction, only a profound sense of the privilege and responsibility of their place. In that moment, the garden felt more sacred, more defined. The single prohibition did not feel like a cage, but like the walls of a cherished home, protecting them from a chaos they could not yet comprehend. With hearts full of love and a will aligned with their Creator's, they made their promise. It was a vow spoken not just with their voices, but with their entire beings, a commitment to trust, to obey, to remain in the light of this relationship forever. They turned their backs on the shimmering tree, choosing the life they knew, the peace of the garden, and the sound of their Creator's footsteps in the cool of the day. For now, the choice was simple, and their hearts were steadfast. Chapter 5. The Sneaky Serpent. The serpent moved through the undergrowth with a liquid grace that belied its cunning nature, its scales catching dappled sunlight like scattered coins. It was the most subtle of all the creatures God had made, a being of coiled intelligence and silken motion, and on this day a new purpose burned within its cold reptilian blood. It found Eve alone near the center of the garden, where the air was thick with the perfume of blooming things, and the forbidden tree stood in its unsettling splendor. She was tracing the velvety petal of a lily, her thoughts a quiet stream of contentment, when a soft, sibilant hiss, not of warning, but of invitation, drew her attention. The creature was draped elegantly over a low-hanging branch, its head cocked in a semblance of friendly curiosity. Its eyes held no malice, only a deep, unsettling intelligence that seemed to look directly into the core of her being. The question it posed was not a roar that shattered the peace, but a whisper that insinuated itself into the quiet spaces of her mind. It asked, with a tone of genuine, almost sympathetic inquiry about the one rule that governed their paradise. Why had God said they could not eat from every tree in the garden? The words were chosen with precision, designed not to confront, but to gently probe the foundation of her trust, to plant the first tiny seed of doubt in soil that had known only faith. Eve turned to the serpent, her expression one of innocent surprise. There was no fear in her, for enmity was yet unborn in the world. She saw only another of God's creations, one that seemed interested in the divine decree. With a heart still pure in its intention, she explained the rule as she understood it. They could eat freely from the abundance of Eden, from every tree that offered sustenance and delight. But of this one tree, the tree in the very midst of the garden, they were not to eat, nor even to touch it, lest they die. She repeated the warning faithfully, the words a shield she had never before needed to raise. The concept of death was an abstract horror, a shapeless shadow she could not fully grasp, known only through the solemnity of God's voice. The serpent listened, its forked tongue tasting the air around her words. It did not argue, nor did it scoff. Instead, it maintained its posture of friendly concern, its presence a calm and seemingly reasonable counterpoint to the absolute prohibition. It allowed the weight of the single restriction to hang in the air between them, letting Eve feel its singularity, its stark contrast to the boundless freedom that surrounded it. The creature's silence was more potent than any rebuttal, a void that invited her own thoughts to rush in and fill it. It made the rule seem, for the very first time, not like a protective boundary, but like a solitary chain in a world of limitless flight. The serpent had not yet spoken a lie, but it had masterfully reframed the truth, casting the loving command of a father as a puzzling limitation from a distant ruler. The conversation was far from over, and the first delicate thread of trust had begun to fray. The serpent's voice was a low, melodious whisper, a sound that seemed to coil around Eve's thoughts like smoke. It did not contradict her directly, but instead offered a different lens through which to view the divine command, a lens that warped and magnified her own burgeoning curiosity. The creature's eyes, gleaming with an ancient knowing light, fixed upon hers as it delivered its artful deception. God knows, it murmured, its tone laced with conspiratorial confidence, that the very day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You will not die. The word die was dismissed with a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of its tongue, making the grave warning seem like a childish fear, an exaggeration meant to control. Instead, it promised, "You will become like God, knowing good and evil." The words hung in the air, vibrating with a terrible, attractive power. Like God. The phrase echoed in the chambers of Eve's mind, stirring something deep and dormant. To possess wisdom, to see the world not with the innocent, accepting eyes of a child, but with the discerning knowledge of the Creator himself. It was a dizzying, intoxicating prospect. The serpent painted a picture not of death and decay, but of ascension and enlightenment, presenting disobedience not as a fall, but as a promotion. Her gaze, almost against her will, was drawn back to the tree. It seemed to pulse with a new compelling energy, as if responding to the serpent's words. The fruit was no longer just a beautiful, forbidden object. It was now a vessel of immense potential. She studied it with an intensity she had never before allowed herself. The skin was a perfect, unblemished tapestry of red and gold, so vibrant it seemed to hold its own light source within. She imagined its texture, smooth and firm, yielding to the pressure of her teeth. She could almost taste the burst of flavor, a sweetness more profound than any other in the garden, a sweetness that was the very essence of the knowledge it promised. The memory of God's warning was still there, a faint, cold echo in the back of her consciousness, but it was being steadily overwhelmed by the heat of this new desire. The serpent's logic felt smooth and persuasive, fitting into the empty spaces of her understanding. Why would God withhold such a gift if it were truly good? The thought, once unthinkable, now took root. The desire for wisdom began to entwine itself with a flicker of distrust, a suspicion that perhaps there was more to the world than the blissful simplicity she had always known. She wanted to see, to understand, to be like the majestic, all-knowing presence that walked with them in the evening. The fruit glowed, a siren's call promising to fill the one void she had never perceived before, the void of not knowing. The choice was crystallizing before her, no longer a simple matter of obedience, but a crossroads between remaining in a state of dependent innocence and seizing a power that promised to make her complete on her own terms. The garden, for the first time, felt like a cage, and the forbidden fruit was the key. Chapter 6. Eve's Big Decision. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a spider's silk, suspended between the world she knew and the abyss the serpent had unveiled. Every leaf, every breath of wind seemed to hold its breath with her. The memory of God's voice was a fading echo, a ghost of a warning drowned out by the thunderous, alluring promise of becoming like God. Her hand, which had moments before been still at her side, began to lift, moving as if guided by a force outside herself. The air around the tree felt charged, electric, humming with the gravity of the choice about to be made. Her fingers, trembling slightly, did not brush against a leaf or a branch. They moved with a dreadful, deliberate purpose, bypassing all else to close around the smooth, warm skin of the fruit itself. It came, away from the stem, with a soft, sighing snap, a sound that seemed to sever something fundamental in the fabric of Eden. The fruit was heavy in her palm, its weight both physical and immense with consequence. It pulsed with that strange inner light, and the swirling colors of its skin seemed to deepen, to pull her gaze into their vortex. She could feel its perfect firmness, the promise of the juicy flesh within. All of the serpent's whispered lies, all of her own burgeoning desires for wisdom and power crystallized in this single, tangible object. There was no turning back now. The act of picking it was the first half of the rebellion. The second was inevitable. She raised the fruit to her lips. The scent was intoxicating, a fragrance of spice and honey that was entirely foreign to the garden's familiar blossoms. For a heartbeat, she paused, a final, fleeting image of Adam's trusting face and the comforting sound of the divine footsteps flashing through her mind. Then it was gone, extinguished by the overwhelming need to know. She opened her mouth and took a bite. The taste was a shock, a sweetness so intense it was almost a pain, followed by a complex, bitter tang that lingered on her tongue. It was nothing like the simple, nourishing fruits from the other trees. This was a flavor of secrets, of hidden things unveiled, and as she swallowed, the change was instantaneous, and profound. It was not a physical transformation, but an internal cataclysm. A floodgate opened in her mind, and a cold, sharp awareness poured in, washing over her innocence and leaving something stained and complex in its wake. She knew good, because she now knew its opposite. She knew nakedness, not as a state of natural being, but as a condition of shame. She knew fear, the chilling terror of having disobeyed an absolute power. The world did not become clearer, it became fractured, seen through the jagged lens of her own transgression. The garden's perfect light now seemed harsh, exposing her. Her eyes, wide with this new and terrible knowledge, found Adam, who had been tending to a vine a short distance away. He looked at her, and in his face she saw the last vestiges of the uncomplicated world they had lost. A frantic, desperate need seized her, the need to not be alone in this fallen state, to share the burden of this knowledge, to have him join her in the dizzying, terrifying freedom of their choice. She moved toward him, the half-eaten fruit extended in her hand like an offering, like a shared doom. Her expression was a tumultuous mix of triumph and terror, inviting him into the new world she had unlocked, a world where they were now like gods, but gods who were afraid. Chapter 7. Eve's Big Decision. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a spider's silk, suspended between the world she knew and the abyss the serpent had unveiled. Every leaf, every breath of wind seemed to hold its breath with her. The memory of God's voice was a fading echo, a ghost of a warning, drowned out by the thunderous, alluring promise of becoming like God. Her hand, which had moments before been still at her side, began to lift, moving as if guided by a force outside herself. The air around the tree felt charged, electric, humming with the gravity of the choice about to be made. Her fingers, trembling slightly, did not brush against a leaf or a branch. They moved with a dreadful, deliberate purpose, bypassing all else to close around the smooth, warm skin of the fruit itself. It came away from the stem with a soft, sighing snap, a sound that seemed to sever something fundamental in the fabric of Eden. The fruit was heavy in her palm, its weight both physical and immense with consequence. It pulsed with that strange inner light, and the swirling colors of its skin seemed to deepen, to pull her gaze into their vortex. She could feel its perfect firmness, the promise of the juicy flesh within. All of the serpent's whispered lies, all of her own burgeoning desires for wisdom and power, crystallized in this single, tangible object. There was no turning back now. The act of picking it was the first half of the rebellion. The second was inevitable. She raised the fruit to her lips. The scent was intoxicating, a fragrance of spice and honey that was entirely foreign to the garden's familiar blossoms. For a heartbeat, she paused, a final, fleeting image of Adam's trusting face and the comforting sound of the divine footsteps flashing through her mind. Then it was gone, extinguished by the overwhelming need to know. She opened her mouth and took a bite. The taste was a shock, a sweetness so intense it was almost a pain, followed by a complex, bitter tang that lingered on her tongue. It was nothing like the simple, nourishing fruits from the other trees. This was a flavor of secrets, of hidden things unveiled, and as she swallowed, the change was instantaneous and profound. It was not a physical transformation, but an internal cataclysm. A floodgate opened in her mind, and a cold, sharp awareness poured in, washing over her innocence and leaving something stained and complex in its wake. She knew. She knew good because she now knew its opposite. She knew nakedness, not as a state of natural being, but as a condition of shame. She knew fear, the chilling terror of having disobeyed an absolute power. The world did not become clearer, it became fractured, seen through the jagged lens of her own transgression. The garden's perfect light now seemed harsh, exposing her. Her eyes, wide with this new and terrible knowledge, found Adam, who had been tending to a vine a short distance away. He looked at her, and in his face she saw the last vestiges of the uncomplicated world they had lost. A frantic, desperate need seized her, the need to not be alone in this fallen state, to share the burden of this knowledge, to have him join her in the dizzying, terrifying freedom of their choice. She moved torn. Him, the half-eaten fruit extended in her hand like an offering, like a shared doom. Her expression was a tumultuous mix of triumph and terror, inviting him into the new world she had unlocked, a world where they were now like gods, but gods who were afraid. Chapter 8. Adam's Sad Choice. Adam watched Eve approach, the forbidden fruit held out between them like a burning coal. He saw the change in her immediately, a new sharpness in her eyes, a frantic energy in her movements that was entirely alien to the woman he knew. The serene companion who had walked with him in perfect harmony was gone, replaced by this agitated, knowing creature whose gaze seemed to pierce through him. In her outstretched hand, the fruit glowed with a malevolent beauty, its bitten flesh gleaming with a sticky, unnatural sheen. The air itself tasted different, charged with the metallic tang of transgression. A cold dread, colder than any shadow in the garden had ever been, clenched in Adam's chest. He remembered the warning with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, the solemnity in God's voice, the absolute finality of the word death. He understood the choice before him with horrifying precision. To take the fruit was to step across a line from which there was no return, to willingly sever the bond of trust that was the very foundation of his existence. He could still turn away. He could reject her offering, cling to the command, and perhaps even now find a way back to the way things were. But to do that would be to lose her. He would be alone again, but this time in a far more profound and terrible way, separated not by absence, but by a chasm of experience and knowledge. The loneliness he had felt before meeting her was a gentle ache compared to the yawning abyss of losing her now. His eyes moved from Eve's desperate, imploring face to the fruit in her hand. He saw the love he had for her, the bone-deep connection that made her a part of himself, warring with the primal fear of disobedience. In that agonizing moment, the fear of losing her proved stronger than the fear of God. His hand, moving slowly as if through thick water, reached out. His fingers brushed against hers, and he felt the sticky residue of the juice on her skin. He took the fruit. The weight of it was the weight of the world, of every future sorrow and struggle now resting in his palm. There was no more deliberation, only the grim inevitability of his decision. He brought it to his mouth and took a bite. The knowledge did not flood into him. It crashed like a wave, violent and disorienting. The first thing it brought was not wisdom, but a searing, all-consuming shame. His eyes, now opened as the serpent had promised, saw not a deeper beauty, but a glaring flaw. He looked at Eve, and he looked at himself, and for the first time he saw their nakedness. It was no longer the natural, unself-conscious state of their bodies in harmony with creation. It was exposure. It was vulnerability. It was wrong. A hot flush spread across his skin, a burning awareness of every inch of his own flesh, and a new, furtive instinct made him want to cover himself, to hide from her gaze and from the suddenly accusing light of the sun. The perfect unity they had shared was shattered, replaced by a wall of mutual shame and a terrifying newfound sense of isolation, even as they stood mere feet apart. The fruit's promise had been a lie. They were not like God. They were merely naked and afraid. Chapter 9. Hiding in Shame. The shame was a physical presence, a clammy film on their skin that the garden's perfect air could not cool. Where before their bodies had been as natural and unremarked upon as the flowing river or the sturdy trees, now every curve and contour felt like a glaring, indecent exposure. They could not bear to look at each other, their gazes skittering away to land on the ground, the leaves anywhere but on the living evidence of their fall. The instinct to cover themselves was as primal and urgent as the hunger they had once felt for the fruit, a desperate, scrambling need to build a barrier against the world they had unmade. Their hands, which had once tended the garden in joyful partnership, now worked in frantic, furtive haste. They tore large, waxy leaves from a nearby fig tree, the green flesh cool and slightly rough against their trembling fingers. Using slender, tough vines pulled from the undergrowth, they began to sew, their movements clumsy and unpracticed. There was no art to their work, only a raw, panicked necessity. The sharp ends of the vines pricked their skin, drawing tiny beads of blood that seemed like further accusations. They wrapped the crude aprons around their hips, the leaves rustling with every nervous shift of their bodies. The coverings were a poor shield, doing little to quell the inner turmoil, but the mere act of hiding their flesh provided a sliver of relief, a fragile illusion of safety in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. It was then that the sound came, a vibration that began not in the air, but in the very substance of the garden itself. It was the sound of footsteps, familiar and once longed for, now the most terrifying noise in creation. God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. The rhythm of the steps was measured, peaceful, a sound that had always heralded communion and comfort. Now it struck a chord of pure, undiluted terror in their hearts. The approach was not angry or thunderous. It was relentlessly calm, and that made it all the more dreadful. They were not being hunted, but sought, and the thought of being found in their newfound nakedness and guilt was unbearable. With a shared silent understanding, they turned and fled from the sound, not toward it as they always had, but away. They scrambled into the deepest, thickest part of a nearby grove of bushes, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The foliage scratched their arms and legs, but they pushed deeper, seeking the deepest shadows. They crouched down, pulling their knees to their chests, making themselves as small as possible amidst the tangled roots and fallen leaves. The rustle of their leaf garments sounded deafening. In the sudden stillness, they held their breath, listening to the footsteps draw nearer, each soft fall on the earth, a tremor of judgment. They were hidden from view, two figures huddled in the dirt, their faces pale with fear, their eyes wide with the desperate, futile hope that the one who had formed them from the dust would simply pass them by. The garden, once a home of open fellowship, had become a place of hiding. The voice that called their names was not a roar of thunder from the heavens, nor a shout of anger that shook the leaves from the trees. It was the same voice that had once spoken light into being, that had named the stars and whispered the garden into bloom, a sound of profound depth and intimate familiarity. It was a father's call, echoing through the tranquil aisles of Eden, searching for his children in the cool of the day. Where are you? The question hung in the air, not born of ignorance, but of heartbreaking invitation, a final chance to step out from the shadows and into the light of confession. Crouched in the thorny embrace of the bushes, Adam and Eve froze. The sound of their own names, spoken with that same tender ownership as when they were first created, lanced through them more sharply than any serpent's tooth. It was a sound that belonged to a world they had just shattered, a reminder of a relationship they had irrevocably broken. The voice held no accusation, only a sorrowful seeking that made their guilt feel like a physical weight, crushing them deeper into the dirt. They pressed themselves against the rough bark of a tree trunk, the crude fig leaves scratching their skin, a pathetic armor against the piercing gentleness of that call. Eve squeezed her eyes shut, as if by not seeing she could cease to be. The divine voice resonated in the hollow space where her innocence had once lived, each syllable a fresh wave of remorse. She could feel Adam trembling beside her, his breath held in his chest until it burned. To answer would be to step into the open, to stand exposed not just in body, but in soul, before the one from whom nothing could be hidden. The knowledge they had gained now screamed its true nature. It was the knowledge of their own inadequacy, their own betrayal. The wisdom they had coveted now showed them only the yawning chasm between what they were and what they were meant to be. The call faded, leaving a silence that was more terrible than the sound itself. It was a silence that waited, heavy with patient, wounded love. They remained motionless, two statues of shame hidden in God's own garden. The fragrance of blooming flowers, once a delight, now felt like a mockery. The gentle breeze that rustled the leaves seemed to whisper their sin. They were lost, not in a place, but in themselves, and the voice of the one who could find them was the very thing they feared most. The question, "Where are you?" was not about their physical location, but about the catastrophic distance they had created in their hearts. And huddled in the dark, they had no answer, only the deafening, guilty silence of their hiding. The footsteps did not pass by. They paused at the edge of the thicket, a silence more profound than any sound settling over the grove. Then the leaves at the periphery of their hiding place seemed to part, not by any physical hand, but by the sheer force of a presence that could not be denied. The light which they had sought to escape now found them, illuminating their huddled forms in the dirt, their leaf-covered bodies, and the stark terror in their eyes. There was no anger in that gaze, only a deep, immeasurable sorrow that seemed to see straight through the foliage and into the fractured core of their beings. They were found. Adam's voice, when it finally came, was a ragged, broken thing, stripped of all the confidence he had once possessed as the garden's steward. He did not stand, but remained crouched, his face turned away as he spoke to the ground. He confessed to hearing the sound of God's walk in the garden, and the reason for their hiding tumbled out in a rush of raw, unvarnished shame. He was afraid, he said, because he was naked. The word, which had once meant nothing, now carried the full weight of their transgression. It was an admission of exposure, of vulnerability, of a self-awareness that felt like a disease. In stating his nakedness, he was confessing his guilt without yet naming the sin, the fear of being seen for what he had become outweighing the fear of the consequence itself. God's response was not to the symptom, but to the root. The question that followed was gentle, yet it pierced deeper than any accusation. Who told you that you were naked? The query hung in the air, a divine scalpel poised over the wound. It pointed to the source of their new terrible knowledge. It forced the conversation from the consequence, their shame, to the cause, their disobedience. And then the final inescapable question came, the one they had been dreading since the moment the fruit's juice had touched their tongues. Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? The command was reiterated, the boundary clearly remembered, making their action not a simple mistake, but a willful, knowing choice. The garden was utterly still, waiting for the confession that would now forever change the relationship between Creator and creation, the admission that would echo through all of human history. The truth, which they had tried to hide amongst the leaves, was now demanded in the open. Chapter 10. The Blame Game. The silence that followed God's question was thick and heavy, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Adam felt the divine gaze upon him, a gaze that saw past the trembling hands, the averted eyes, and the crude fig leaves straight into the heart of his rebellion. The truth was a stone in his throat, but fear and a newfound desperate instinct for self-preservation shaped it into something else entirely. He did not look at Eve, could not bear to see the reflection of his own failure in her eyes. Instead, he fixed his gaze on a root twisting from the ground and let the words fall, not as a confession, but as an indictment. "The woman," he said, his voice tight and foreign to his own ears, "the woman you gave to be with me." In that single damning sentence, he did two things at once. He shifted the responsibility from his own shoulders onto Eve's, painting himself as a passive recipient of her fatal offer. But more profoundly, he subtly implicated the giver. "The woman you gave me." It was a deflection that reached all the way to the throne, a whispered accusation that the source of his downfall was the very gift meant to be his completion. He had eaten, yes, but the fault lay with her, and by extension with the one who had crafted her from his side and presented her to him in joy. "It was not my choice," his words implied, "but the consequence of your design." Then it was Eve's turn. The focus of that sorrowful, all-knowing presence shifted to her, and she flinched under its weight. Adam's betrayal was a fresh wound, a cold sting that mingled with the heat of her own guilt. She had been deceived, a pawn in a game she had not understood, and a frantic need to explain, to justify, to lessen her own culpability seized her. Her eyes darted to the shadows where the serpent had been, where the memory of its smooth, persuasive voice still coiled in her mind. "The serpent," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. The serpent deceived me. It was a statement of fact, yet it was wielded as a shield. She laid the primary blame at the feet of the cunning creature, presenting herself as the victim of a masterful trick, her own desire and will subsumed by a greater external cunning. She had been naive, trusting, led astray. In her telling, the act of reaching, picking, and biting became a passive event that happened to her, rather than a conscious choice she made. She, too, told a version of the truth, but it was a truth carefully curated to highlight her gullibility and minimize her volition. God listened. He stood before them, the Creator witnessing the fracturing of His creation, not with the rage they feared, but with a profound silent sadness that was infinitely worse. He heard the fear in Adam's voice, the desperate plea in Eve's. He heard the birth of the blame game, the human impulse to point fingers, to build walls of accusation instead of bowing in unified repentance. This was the first fruit of the knowledge they had so coveted, not godlike wisdom, but the frantic, shame-filled scramble to avoid responsibility. The unity he had crafted between them was broken, replaced by a new chasm of mutual recrimination. They stood before him not as one flesh, but as two isolated individuals, each trying to save themselves by casting their sin onto another. And in the quiet of the garden, God's heart broke, not for the punishment he must enact, but for the relational ruin his children had chosen for themselves. Chapter 11. God's words to the serpent, the divine gaze which had rested with such sorrow upon the two trembling humans, now turned. It shifted from the tangled grove of blame and settled upon the shadows where the serpent lurked, its sleek form still coiled with the pride of its successful deception. The air, which had been heavy with the weight of human failure, now crackled with a different energy, a righteous, unwavering judgment that was as absolute as the original command had been. The serpent, which had spoken with such clever subtlety, now found itself frozen, stripped of all its guile, before the presence of pure truth. There would be no questions for it, no invitation to explain. Its role was clear, and its sentence was pronounced with a finality that would echo through the ages. "Because you have done this," the voice declared, and the words were not a question, but a condemnation that sealed its fate. The curse that fell upon the serpent was immediate and profound, a fundamental rewriting of its very nature and existence. It was cursed above all livestock and above every beast of the field. The form it had once possessed, a form that may have been upright and majestic, was now stripped from it. "On your belly you shall go," God declared, and the creature's body seemed to flatten and elongate in that moment, its stature diminished to a perpetual crawl through the dust from which Adam had been formed. Its new existence would be one of humiliation, its belly forever grinding against the earth, a living reminder of its lowly state. "And dust you shall eat all the days of your life." Its sustenance would be mingled with the soil, a constant, gritty reminder of its defeat and degradation. But the curse went deeper than mere physical transformation. It struck at the heart of the relational chaos it had engineered. "I will put enmity between you and the woman," God proclaimed, "and between your offspring and her offspring." The friendly, deceptive whisper was replaced by an eternal, instinctive hostility. The serpent and humanity would forever be locked in a state of spiritual war, two lineages destined for conflict. The creature that had sought to insinuate itself into their trust would now be met with revulsion and fear, its very presence a symbol of the evil it had introduced into the world. Yet, in the midst of this severe judgment, a single, brilliant spark of hope was kindled, a promise that pierced the gloom of the newly fallen world. "He shall bruise your head," God said of the woman's future offspring, and you shall bruise his heel. The words painted a picture of a cosmic battle yet to come. The serpent would strike. It would inflict a wound, but it would be a glancing blow to the heel. The offspring of the woman, however, would deliver a crushing, definitive blow to the head, a fatal wound that would ultimately destroy the power of evil. It was the first gospel, a prophecy of a coming Savior who would one day enter the fray, endure the serpent's sting, but in doing so would triumphantly crush the source of sin and death itself. The curse was severe, but it contained the seed of its own undoing, a promise of redemption that would give Adam and Eve and all their descendants a reason to hope beyond the dust and the thorns. Chapter 12. God's words to Eve, the divine attention heavy with consequence, returned to Eve. She stood with her head bowed, the memory of Adam's blame and her own frantic deflection still burning in her ears. The sorrow in God's gaze was now mingled with a solemn purpose. The time for questions past, the moment of pronouncement at hand. His words were not shouted in fury, but spoken with the grave cadence of immutable law, a delineation of the new reality her choice had forged. The consequences would be as intimate and fundamental as the unity she had shared with Adam, now twisting that very bond into a source of struggle and pain. He spoke first of the profound mystery of life she was designed to carry. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing, he said, and the words settled upon her like a shroud. The act of bringing new life into the world, which should have been the purest echo of God's own creative power, would now be laced with anguish. The joy of conception would be shadowed by the physical trial of labor, a piercing pain that would become the universal gateway for every human entering this fallen existence. It was not a punishment levied from afar, but a transformation of her own body, a reminder woven into the fabric of her being that life would now be purchased with suffering. Then the pronouncement turned to the relationship that had been the cornerstone of the garden. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. The statement was complex, a fracture in their perfect parity. The word desire here held a new, strained connotation, not merely the pull of love and companionship, but a potential for conflict, a struggle for influence and control that had been absent in their innocence. The harmonious interdependence was replaced by a tension, a push and pull, where his leadership could become domineering and her desire could become manipulative. The effortless partnership was gone, replaced by a dynamic they would have to navigate with conscious effort, a constant potential for friction in the very union that was meant to be their refuge. Yet, even in this, there was a thread of grace, a directive buried within the curse. The words, your husband, reaffirmed the bond. They were not sent away from each other, but condemned to work it out, together. The struggle itself was a form of connection, a shared burden. They must work together, God's tone implied, even when it was hard. Even when desire warred with will and leadership risked tipping into oppression, they were to remain one flesh in a broken world, their relationship becoming the primary school where they would learn the costly lessons of forgiveness, sacrifice, and love after the fall. Eve absorbed the words, feeling the weight of this new, complicated future settle upon her shoulders, a future of pain intertwined with purpose, of struggle within the safety of a covenant that, though strained, had not been broken. Chapter 13. God's words to Adam, the weight of judgment, having settled upon the serpent and then upon Eve, now turned its full, sobering gaze upon Adam. He stood, the dust of the garden clinging to his feet, a poignant reminder of his origin and a grim foreshadowing of his end. The air itself seemed to thicken, the playful breeze stilled into a breathless hush, as the Creator prepared to address the one to whom he had given dominion, the one who had listened to the voice of his wife over the command of his God. There was no fury in the divine countenance, only a profound, heartbreaking resolution as the consequences of a single, catastrophic choice were about to be etched into the very soil beneath his feet. God's voice, when it came, was low and resonant, each word falling with the finality of a stone sealing a tomb. "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife," he began, and the phrase hung in the air, acknowledging the tragic inversion of the created order. The helper, designed as a partner in holiness, had become a conduit for sin, and Adam had followed. The primary responsibility, the stewardship, the command, had been his, and he had relinquished it. "And have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat of it." He continued, reiterating the clear, singular law that had governed their paradise. The transgression was named not as a shared mistake, but as Adam's personal failure of leadership and trust. Then the sentence was pronounced, and it struck at the very core of Adam's identity and purpose. "Cursed is the ground because of you." The words were like a shock wave, a divine decree that altered the fundamental nature of creation. The earth, which had been a willing partner, springing forth abundance at his lightest touch, now turned against him. The curse did not land directly upon Adam, a grace, perhaps, in itself, but upon the ground from which he was taken and through which he sustained his life. The perfect symbiosis between man and soil was shattered, replaced by a relationship of struggle and resistance. The voice detailed the new, harsh reality of his existence. "In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life." The effortless harvests were over. The act of drawing food from the earth, once a joy, would now be a lifelong labor, a Sisyphean toil etched with a constant reminder of his failure. The ground, once a canvas of divine generosity, would now produce thorns and thistles for you. Even as God spoke, Adam's eyes seemed to see the very dirt at his feet change, as if invisible seeds of hardship were sprouting in that moment. The image of vicious, sharp-thorned plants and stubborn, tangled weeds invading the cultivated rows filled his mind. These would not be mere inconveniences, they would be active adversaries, choking out the good, draining his strength, and ensuring that every mouthful of bread would be purchased with sweat and strain. The garden's peaceful order had been replaced by a world at war with itself, and Adam, the former steward, was now condemned to a perpetual battle against the cursed ground, a daily grinding reminder of the day he traded paradise for a bite of fruit. The divine pronouncement continued, its gravity settling into the very marrow of Adam's being. The initial curse upon the ground was not the end, but the foundation for a harsher, more personal truth about his own existence. God's gaze, filled with a sorrow that seemed to comprehend all the weary ages to come, remained fixed upon the first man. The judgment now turned from the external world of thorns and thistles to the internal reality of Adam's own body, his labor, and his ultimate end. The sentence was one of exhaustive struggle, a life defined by the sweat of his brow and concluded by the dust from which he came. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life, the voice declared, reinforcing the earlier decree with a chilling permanence. This was not a temporary hardship, but the unalterable condition of his mortality. The word toil implied more than just hard work. It spoke of exhausting, mind-numbing labor, a relentless grind that would consume his days and sap his strength. The effortless harmony of Eden, where fruit fell readily into his hand and the earth yielded its bounty without protest, was now a lost dream. Every meal would henceforth be earned through the ache of muscles and the strain of his back, a constant physical reminder of the price of his disobedience. The act of sustenance, once a joyful communion with creation, was now tethered to pain. The Lord then painted the most vivid and humbling image of this new existence. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Adam could almost feel it, the salty sting in his eyes, the damp heat on his skin, the grime of the cursed soil mingling with his own perspiration. Sweat, the body's response to strain and overheating, became the symbol of his fallen state. It was the currency of survival, the visible sign of his struggle against a world that no longer cooperated. Bread, the simple, fundamental staple of life, would now be born from this agony of effort. Each loaf would tell the story of his fall, a story written in the salt and effort poured into the resistant ground. And finally, the ultimate consequence was spoken, the truth the serpent had so glibly denied, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. The circle of his existence was closed, not with the promise of eternal fellowship in the garden, but with the stark reality of dissolution. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The words echoed the very act of his creation, but now they framed his destiny. The breath of life that God had breathed into that dust was now on a timer. The vibrant, living man, made in the divine image, was none the less mortal, and his body was destined to succumb to the entropy that now governed the world. The grave awaited him, a return to the elemental state from which he was formed. The knowledge of good and evil had come at the cost of knowing his own end, and the shadow of that return to dust would fall across every sweaty, toiling day of his life, a somber drumbeat counting down to the final, inescapable silence. Chapter 14. Leaving Eden. The finality of their new reality settled upon them not like a sudden storm, but like a slow, chilling dusk that extinguished the last vestiges of Paradise's eternal noon. The divine pronouncements had been made, the curses spoken into the very fabric of their existence and the world around them. A profound silence followed, deeper than any they had known, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing and the distant mournful call of a bird. They stood together, yet isolated in their private grief, the weight of thorns, pain, and dust pressing down upon their souls. The garden, which had been a home, now felt like a beautiful prison from which they were both unworthy to stay and terrified to leave. Then God spoke again, and his words carried a new and different gravity, one of protective, heartbreaking necessity. He said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." The statement was an acknowledgment of the bitter fruit of their rebellion. They had indeed gained a knowledge, but it was the knowledge of their own fallenness, a consciousness that now separated them from his holy presence. The innocence that had allowed them to walk with him openly was gone. replaced by a shame that made his nearness a terror. And now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished but utterly clear. It was the final, merciful logic of a love that would not allow their catastrophe to become eternal. To live forever in this state, in this fractured relationship, in this body destined for dust, with this searing knowledge of good and evil festering in their hearts, would be a fate worse than death. It would be an unending existence of spiritual and relational decay, a perpetual hell of their own making. The tree of life, which once stood as a symbol of unending communion, now represented a danger. To partake of it in their sinful condition would be to seal their doom, to make brokenness permanent, to freeze them in a state of eternal exile from the heart of God. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden. The act was not one of petty vengeance, but of severe mercy. It was the closing of a door to protect them from a far worse fate. An unseen, irrevocable boundary was established between them and the life they had known. They were driven out, guided by an invisible but irresistible force that compelled them to walk away from the shimmering groves, the gentle river, and the two central trees that had defined their destiny. The eastward gate of the garden, once a welcoming entrance, now became the threshold of exile, and to guard the way to the tree of life, God stationed cherubim, magnificent and terrifying beings of flame and sword, their presence a blazing, impassable barrier. The turning sword, flashing with a light that was both beautiful and deadly, moved in a relentless pattern, ensuring that there would be no return, no unauthorized grasp for immortality. The way back was closed forever, not to punish them with longing, but to protect them from themselves and to leave a thread of hope that one day a different way home might be opened. The path away from the garden was not paved with stone or marked by any sign, but it was unmistakable, a subtle gradient of loss that led from lush, tended soil to the untamed, waiting earth. With each step, the air grew thinner, the golden light of Eden dimming behind them to a soft, tapering glow. They did not walk quickly, their feet dragging as if the very ground mourned their departure. The vibrant chorus of birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves began to fade, replaced by a wind that carried unfamiliar scents, the raw tang of wild grasses, the dry dust of open plains, the faint, musky odor of beasts they had never named. It was the smell of a world unknown, vast and uncurated, and it filled them with a cold, creeping dread. Halfway to the shimmering boundary where the cherubim stood watch, Adam stopped. He could not help himself. He turned, his body a silhouette against the receding splendor, and looked back. The sight struck him with a physical force, a pain so sharp it felt like a wound. There was the river, a ribbon of liquid diamond weaving through emerald meadows. There were the groves of trees, their branches heavy with fruit that required no toil, their leaves whispering secrets of a peace they had forsaken. He could see the very spot where he had first opened his eyes to see Eve, where their laughter had once mingled with the bubbling streams. It was all still there, perfect and pristine, a masterpiece locked behind an invisible wall. It was no longer their home, but a memory, a beautiful, agonizing ghost of what was and what could never be again. Eve stood beside him, her hand finding his, Her own gaze was fixed on the garden, her eyes brimming with a sorrow too deep for tears. She saw the sheltered bower where they had hidden in their shame, the very fig tree whose leaves now scratched against their skin in a crude imitation of covering. She remembered the cool of the evening, the sound of footsteps that had once brought joy instead of terror. Now, those footsteps had driven them out, and the memory was a bruise upon her soul. The weight of her choices, the serpent's whisper, the fruit's deceptive sheen, the offering to Adam, crashed over her in a fresh wave. They were exiles, cast out not just from a place, but from a state of being, from the direct presence that had been the sun to their world. Together, they turned from the view, the image of paradise burning itself into their minds forever. The final steps toward the gate were the hardest, each one a conscious acceptance of their new reality. They passed the cherubim, feeling the heat of the flaming sword on their faces, seeing the blinding holy light that reflected in the creature's unwavering eyes. There was no malice in that gaze, only a solemn, implacable duty. And then they were through, standing on the other side. The gate, whatever form it took, was now behind them. Before them stretched a wilderness, bathed in the same sun, but under a harsher light across a harder ground. They were alone, armed only with their flawed love, their shared guilt, and the terrifying, uncertain freedom of a world they must now shape with their own bleeding hands. The garden was closed, and the long, slow walk into history had begun. Chapter 15. God's kind act. The harsh reality of their exile was a cold cloak upon their shoulders, the unfamiliar winds of the wild world already plucking at the edges of their hastily made fig leaf coverings. The leaves, once a desperate solution, now felt flimsy and absurd, a pathetic testament to their fallen state against the vast, untamed landscape that stretched before them. They stood shivering, not just from the chill in the air, but from the profound vulnerability that their nakedness now represented, a vulnerability of body and spirit in a world no longer designed to protect them. The shame was a constant companion, and the crude garments did little to shield them from its sting or from the elements they had never before had to fear. But even in the midst of executing judgment, the heart of the Creator did not abandon them to their desperation. Before they took their first trembling steps into the wilderness, a final, poignant act of mercy unfolded. God Himself, the same voice that had pronounced the curses and driven them from the garden, now approached them not as a judge, but as a provider. In His hands were garments, but these were not woven from leaves or grass. They were crafted from animal skins, a substance far more durable and protective than anything they could have fashioned for themselves. The making of these skins spoke of a profound and sorrowful grace. An animal, one of the innocent creatures Adam had once named in peace, had given its life. Its blood, a stark and new concept of sacrifice, had been shed. This was the first death they witnessed, a direct consequence of the spiritual death they had introduced, a tangible, terrible price paid for their covering. The act was a silent lesson in the cost of sin, but also a profound demonstration of God's care. He did not leave them to fend for themselves in their shame. He intervened, providing a solution they could never have devised, a covering that was both physical and symbolic. With a tenderness that belied the severity of their exile, God helped them into the new garments. The skins were soft and supple, treated by a divine hand, and they wrapped around their bodies with a weight that was both strange and comforting. The warmth was immediate, a barrier against the wind that their leaf aprons could never have provided. The rough, scratchy feeling of the foliage was replaced by the smooth, protective embrace of leather. It was a covering that acknowledged their fallen state, a need born of sin, while simultaneously meeting that need with unmerited kindness. As Adam and Eve looked down at themselves, clad in the skins, a complex mix of emotions warred within them. There was grief for the life that had been taken, a sobering understanding of the new harsh economy of a world where life now came at the cost of life. But there was also a dawning, humble gratitude, even in their punishment. Even as they stood on the threshold of a life of toil and pain, they were not abandoned. The God who had driven them out had also clothed them. The garments were a promise woven into leather and sinew, a promise that His justice was always tempered with mercy, that His judgment was never divorced from His love. They were a tangible reminder that though they were exiles, they were still His, and He would, in His own mysterious ways, provide for them. Clothed in God's own handiwork, they turned from the closed gate of Eden not just as condemned beings, but as recipients of a grace that would follow them into the long-shadowed years ahead. Chapter 16. First day. Outside. The world beyond the garden gate was a symphony of unfamiliar sensations, each one a sharp and startling note after the muted harmony of Eden. The sun, which had once filtered through the canopy in gentle, golden shafts, now beat down upon them with a direct, unsoftened intensity, its heat pressing against the animal skin garments God had given them. It was a heat that demanded acknowledgment, a force to be endured rather than enjoyed. The wind, too, had changed its character. In the garden, it had been a soft sigh, a carrier of floral perfumes. Here, it was a restless entity, whipping across open ground, carrying the scents of dry earth, wild herbs, and things unknown. It tugged at their hair and clothes, a constant whispering reminder of their exposure to a world no longer curated for their comfort. They stood for a long moment, side by side, their hands clasped tightly. The ground beneath their feet was different, harder, packed with stones and tangled with tough, wiry grasses that scraped against their ankles. Before them, the land rolled away in great, untamed swells, dotted with gnarled trees and thickets that promised both shelter and hidden dangers. The sheer raw scope of it was overwhelming. Eden had been a contained masterpiece. This was a sprawling, unfinished canvas, and they were now a part of its wild, uncertain story. Every rustle in the grass, every distant cry of a bird of prey sent a jolt of primal alertness through them, their newfound knowledge of good and evil now translated into a constant low-grade fear of the unknown. Adam's eyes scanned the horizon, no longer looking for beauty to admire, but for utility to exploit. His mind, once occupied with names and wonder, now calculated survival. He pointed toward a rocky outcrop a distance away where a stand of sturdy trees offered some protection from the elements. It was not a home. It lacked the flowing water, the gentle slopes, the effortless abundance they had left behind. But it was a place, a starting point in the vast emptiness, a place to hide from the sun's glare and the wind's bite, a place to begin the lifelong toil of building something from nothing. Together they began to walk, their steps tentative on the unfamiliar terrain. Eve's gaze swept the ground not to admire wild flowers, but to note the location of edible-looking berries and the presence of thorny vines they would need to avoid. The weight of their future settled upon them with each step, the need for shelter, for a reliable source of water, for a patch of ground to till. The memory of the garden was a beautiful, painful ghost at their backs, but the demands of the present were immediate and unyielding. They were pioneers in a cursed land, their first day outside defined not by the peace they had lost, but by the daunting necessary search for a new foothold in a world that was no longer their friend. Chapter 17. Adam's new work. The sun beat down with a relentless, unfamiliar heat. Its rays no longer filtered through Eden's benevolent canopy, but falling directly upon Adam's back like a physical weight. Before him stretched a patch of hard, unyielding earth, a stark contrast to the soft, fertile loam of the garden. This was his new domain, a kingdom of dust and defiance. He gripped a sharpened stick, the first tool of his exile, and drove it into the ground. The impact sent a jarring shock of his arms. The soil resisted, clumping around the point in a compacted mass that had to be broken apart by force. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not the gentle perspiration of a warm day, but a stinging, salty torrent that dripped into his eyes and traced muddy paths through the grime on his cheeks. This was the sweat of his face, the currency of his survival, just as God had said. Weeds, tough and tenacious, grew everywhere, their roots like iron threads woven through the dirt. Thistles, with their vicious, needle-sharp spines, snagged at the animal skin covering on his legs, a constant, painful reminder of the ground's curse. He worked on his knees, his fingers digging, pulling, tearing at the unwanted growth. His muscles, once used for gentle tending and joyful exploration, now burned with a deep, unfamiliar ache. Each handful of torn weeds revealed more of the stubborn ground, littered with small stones that had to be cleared one by one. This was not stewardship, it was war, a daily grinding battle against a creation that now fought back at every turn. Nearby, Eve worked alongside him, her own hands raw from the labor. She sifted through the broken clods of earth, clearing the smaller debris Adam's work turned up. But her mind was not entirely on the task. As she felt the gritty soil under her nails and the strain in her own back, her thoughts drifted back across the impossible distance to the garden. She remembered the ease of it all. She pictured Adam reaching up into a tree, his hand closing around a perfect, sun-warmed fruit that came away willingly, joyfully into his palm. There were no thorns, no weeds, no sweat. The earth had been a partner, offering its abundance as a gift. The work had been a rhythm of communion, a light and pleasant task that felt more like play than labor. Now every movement was effort, every inch of ground a negotiation. The memory was so vivid, so achingly beautiful, that it cast the harsh reality of their present toil into even sharper, more painful relief. She watched Adam, his brow furrowed in concentration and strain, and her heart ached with a loss that was as physical as the dirt beneath her knees. They were farming, yes, but it was a pale, painful shadow of the care they had once given to paradise, a constant, wearying reminder of all they had thrown away. Chapter 18. Eve's First Pain. A new kind of pain, sharp and internal, unlike the superficial scratches from thorns or the ache of tired muscles, seized Eve without warning. It was a deep, cramping agony that coiled in her abdomen, a visceral tearing that spoke not of external hardship, but of an internal curse now awakening within her own body. She gasped, her hands flying to her middle as her knees buckled, sending her stumbling against the rough trunk of a wild olive tree. This was not the consequence of labor in a field. This was the curse speaking from within, a direct and intimate fulfillment of God's words. The pain of childbearing had announced itself, a harbinger of the suffering that would accompany the very gift of life she was created to bestow. It was a pain that isolated her in her own flesh, a private, grinding reminder that the fall had corrupted even the most sacred of her functions. Adam saw her falter and was at her side in an instant, his own weariness forgotten. He saw the pallor of her skin, the sheen of a new, different kind of sweat on her brow, and the way her fingers dug into her stomach as if to hold herself together. The sight of her in such raw distress sent a fresh wave of helpless guilt crashing over him. This was the price of the fruit he had eaten, the consequence of his failure now manifesting in the body of the one he loved. He could fight the thorns in the hard ground, but he was powerless against this internal enemy. He could only hold her, his strong arms a poor substitute for the wholeness they had lost, his presence a silent apology for a ruin he could not undo. As the initial shocking wave of pain subsided into a dull, ominous throb, Eve leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his solidity. She saw the torment in his eyes, the weight of the world and her suffering bowing his shoulders. Her own pain, instead of breeding resentment, ignited a fierce, protective compassion. She touched his cheek, her fingers smudged with the soil of his toil. She did not speak of the pain, but of the promise. She reminded him of the words spoken to the serpent, the prophecy that had pierced the darkness of their judgment. The one who would come, the offspring who would crush the serpent's head. This pain, she whispered, her voice strained but steady, was not the end. It was a part of the story, a dark thread in a tapestry that God was still weaving, a tapestry that would one day include a Savior. In the midst of her first real suffering, she became a comforter, pointing her husband away from their present anguish and toward the distant, unwavering star of God's redemptive promise. Chapter 19. Remembering the Promise. The first fire they built was a small, defiant miracle in the vast, encroaching darkness. Its flames, orange and hungry, devoured the dry branches Adam had gathered, pushing back the chill of the wilderness night and the deeper cold of their exile. They huddled close to its warmth, the animal skin garments God had given them smelling faintly of wood smoke. Beyond their tiny circle of light, the world was a chorus of unfamiliar sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures, the lonely sigh of the wind through the grasses. It was a world of shadows, both outside and within their own hearts. Eve stirred the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the star-dusted sky. The flames cast shifting patterns on their weary faces, illuminating the lines of toil and sorrow that were already etching themselves there. The memory of the garden was a constant, beautiful ache. But tonight, a different memory surfaced, one that held not pain, but a fragile, stubborn hope. She looked across the fire at Adam, his gaze lost in the flickering depths. "The serpent," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the night's stillness. Adam's eyes met hers, and he knew instantly the memory she invoked. It was not the serpent's clever lie they recalled, nor the shame of their hiding, but the words that had come after, the divine sentence that contained a secret, brilliant seed. Together, in the quiet language of shared remembrance, they pieced it back together. They recalled the terrible curse laid upon the deceiver, the condemnation to crawl in the dust, the eternal enmity declared, but then the promise, the words that had seemed almost to glow in the gloom of their judgment. He will crush your head. The offspring of the woman, a future deliverer born of their own lineage, who would one day confront the source of all their misery and deal it a final, decisive blow. The serpent would strike at his heel, a wound, yes, but a glancing one. The Savior would crush its head, a fatal, triumphant victory. As they sat in the fire's glow, the promise began to burn brighter than the flames before them. It was a star to navigate by in their newfound darkness. The thorns in the field, the sweat on Adam's brow, the lingering echo of Eve's pain, these were not the whole story. They were part of a struggle, a long war, but the promise whispered that the war would not last forever. There was an end in sight, a redemption planned before the foundation of the world. The weight of their exile did not vanish, but it was suddenly bearable, shared not only between the two of them, but with this unseen hope, this future champion who would one day walk the broken earth to set it right. The fire crackled, a small brave light against the immense dark, and for the first time since leaving Eden, they felt not just fear and sorrow, but a quiet, unshakable anticipation for a dawn still thousands of years away. Chapter 20. Building a home, the need for shelter, was a primal urgency, a truth written in the chill of the night and the threat of rain on the wind. The rocky outcrop they had chosen offered a partial barrier, a rough stone shoulder against the elements, but it was not enough. The cave behind it was dark, damp, and echoed with a loneliness that reminded them of the tomb. They could not simply hide. They had to build. And so on a morning when the sky was the color of bruised slate, they began the work that would become the foundation of all human endeavor, the construction of a home. It was an act of faith, a declaration that they would not merely survive in the wild world, but would carve out a space for life within it, a sanctuary against the curse. Adam's hands, already calloused from tilling the stubborn ground, now turned to the trees. He selected young, straight saplings, their wood still green and pliable. Using a sharp-edged stone, he hacked and sawed at their bases until they fell with a series of soft, cracking sighs. The work was grueling, a constant battle of muscle against fiber, his breath pluming in the cool air. Each fallen tree was a small victory, a raw material wrested from the wilderness. He dragged them to the site, their branches scraping furrows in the earth, and began to fashion them into a frame. He lashed the poles together with tough, pliable vines, his knots clumsy at first, then growing more sure with each attempt. It was a slow, deliberate process, a physical prayer for stability. Eve's role was different, but no less vital. While Adam wrestled with the skeleton of their shelter, she gathered. She combed the area for broad, fibrous leaves and great armfuls of long, dry grass. She collected clay from the bank of a nearby stream, carrying it back in lumps that cooled her hands. Her work was one of weaving and filling, of creating the flesh to cover the bones of their future home. She showed Adam how to weave the grasses into thick mats, her fingers moving with an intuitive skill that spoke of a design woven into her very being. Together, they packed the clay and mud into the gaps between the saplings, daubing the walls with a mixture of earth and water, sealing out the wind. It was messy, exhausting work. The mud caked under their nails and streaked their skin, and more than once a section of the wall would slump and require rebuilding. But in the shared struggle, something began to heal. The silence between them, which had so often been filled with the unspoken weight of blame and regret, was now punctuated by the sounds of cooperative effort, the scrape of wood, the slap of mud, a shared grunt of effort as they lifted a heavy beam into place. Their eyes would meet over a successfully tied knot or a smoothly woven mat, and a flicker of the old partnership, the unity of the garden, would pass between them. They were learning to trust each other again, not as the flawless companions of paradise, but as flawed and fallible partners in a broken world, bound together by a shared task and a shared hope. They were building more than a shelter from the rain. They were building a new kind of relationship, one forged in the sweat and clay of their exile, a testament to their slow, painful choice to rely on one another, and in doing so, to trust again in the God who had not abandoned them, even here, outside the walls of Eden. Chapter 21. Hope for the Future. The first stars pricked the velvet expanse of the night sky, their cold, clean light a silent testament to an order that transcended the chaos of their fallen world. The simple shelter stood behind them, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue, its mud-daubed walls holding the day's residual warmth and the memory of their shared labor. Adam and Eve sat before the embers of their fire, the day's weariness a heavy cloak upon their shoulders, but their gaze was lifted upward, beyond the smoke and the shadows, to the glittering promise overhead. The vast, silent cathedral of the night invited not fear, but a reverence that had been absent in the perpetual noon of Eden. Slowly, as if moved by a shared, unspoken instinct, they knelt on the hard ground. It was not a posture of cowering supplication, but one of humble acknowledgment. Their hands, still rough from toil and stained with earth, were not clenched in fists of resentment, but open upon their knees, palms turned upward in a gesture of receiving. They had nothing to offer but their brokenness, their regret, and their fragile, tenacious hope. Their prayer was not formed of words, for no language yet existed to contain the tumult of gratitude and longing in their hearts. It was a silent cry, a pouring out of spirit that rose on the cool night air, a confession of their failure, a raw thankfulness for the skins that warmed them and the fire that sustained them, and a desperate, clinging grasp onto the one thing that made the thorns and the pain bearable, the promise. In that quiet communion, a profound shift occurred within them. The memory of the garden's loss was still a sharp pain, but it was no longer a chain binding them to despair. The hardship of their present was a real and grinding weight, but it was no longer a verdict of absolute abandonment. Instead, they felt, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, the persistent, unfathomable love of God. It was a love that had clothed them even in judgment, a love that had spoken a prophecy of redemption even while pronouncing a curse, a love that had not erased the consequences of their choice, but had entered into those consequences with them. This love was the compass that would guide them, not back to a barred paradise, but forward through the wilderness of a broken creation, toward a future where the serpent's head would be crushed and the long exile would find its end. As they rose from their knees, the starlight seemed to wash over them, not as a cold, distant light, but as a blessing. The future was unknown, a path shrouded in mist, filled with certain sorrow and struggle, but it was a future illuminated by a promise. They were exiles, yes, but they were guided exiles. The hard ground was their lot, but they would not walk it alone. Hand in hand, they turned from the dying fire and entered the dark shelter, the simple structure a testament to their resilience and their choice to build anew. The night closed around them, but it was a night filled with stars, each one a silent witness to the hope that now burned in their hearts, a small, steady flame that would guide all their steps toward the dawn of redemption.